basic part of the I am curious. I see Ms. Yang, Ms. Naker, Mr. Tolbert. I know Mr. Dye has an excused absence today, and Ms. Jalali is, of course, at Community First Public Safety. We will get a report from her, I believe, next week on that, or from Community First Public Safety next week. So since it looks like we've got a pretty good group here, and it is after 10, I'm gonna get us rolling. So the St. Paul City Council Organization Committee will come to order. Today we have back-to-back meetings. First, we are getting a report from the Deputy Mayor, Jamie Tincher, on the long-awaited American Rescue Plan spending guidelines and some kind of high-level overview of administration's thinking around the American Rescue Plan dollars. The question the council has been posing since early on is, given this kind of once in a generation or really once in a lifetime funding, we want to establish our role in the strategic side of the planning and spending process. And so this is a step in that direction. And I know that we have been having conversations since this was announced too. It was kind of underlining some of our council priorities, including Community First Public Safety and catching up on deferred maintenance and making sure that we're spending one-time money on one-time expenditures and so on. But this is an opportunity to hear, broadly what the administration is thinking, and I recognize that there's a state of the city in our future, and we'll probably hear things more clearly at that point. But I think the earlier the council is engaged in its full body in this conversation, and the more engaged we are, the more effective I think our decision-making process will be. And I think that one of the things that we'll discuss here today is, with and kind of a separate source influx of dollars, that there will definitely be a strong role for the council in approving expenditures that come that are in addition to budgets that have been passed. For example, in 2021, we're already some of these issues have already come before us in terms of amending the 2021 budget. And so I'm talking a little bit about how and at least initially, we see these two, our regular budget process and the American Rescue Plan dollars, how they knit together in a budget, or if they don't, I think would be helpful, and it's something that I think we can work with the administration on as well. So we're delighted to have you here, Deputy Mayor. I know Laura Logston is here as well from Finance, and I think John McCarthy as well. So we have a full house in terms of folks that can answer questions. And again, I think if I recall correctly, we just got the spending guidelines 2 days ago. So hopefully you have it all perfectly presented and ready to tell us exactly how things are going to go in 48 hours. We do recognize that this is quick, but on the other hand, I think it underscores our value in engaging early. So I will, without more banter, I will turn things over to you, Deputy Mayor, and you can direct your presentation however you'd like. I'll keep my eye on our colleagues and interrupt you as needed for questions. And otherwise, the floor is yours, and welcome. We're delighted to have you here this morning.
Thank you. That sounds great. Thank you, Council President, Council members. Thank you for inviting us. We're glad to be here. I think your opening, I think we will touch on pretty well all of the things that you laid out that you all are hoping to hear from us with. I have with me Finance Director John McCarthy and our Budget Director Tara Bernock, and Laura Logston has moved into the role of being our Federal Funding Opportunities Budget Manager. As you mentioned, that we basically have dollars that are going to come in that are equivalent to our levy and LGA budgeting process. And so we needed to staff to that new reality. So they are going to help in this presentation as well. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are with our work to support our residents that are experiencing homelessness. And I think that will help frame up sort of the work group process and sort of how we could all come together in different ways around priorities that we all share.
Great.
So if we go to the next slide. Just as a setup, in 2020, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, our community experienced unemployment and stress in all businesses and residents throughout the city. The housing crisis was exacerbated, and we saw a dramatic increase in the need to support our residents experiencing homelessness, while at the same time we were working to prevent evictions. We needed to meet city staff and community needs for personal protective equipment through challenging supply shortages. And now we're focused on the work to get vaccinations to our entire community. As you all recall, when we needed to make budget decisions in 2020, we didn't know what would happen with COVID in 2021. To be best positioned to respond if we didn't receive additional federal disaster assistance and or if we experienced another year without vaccinations, part of our finance strategy to respond to the public health and economic crises facing our community was that the City of St. Paul avoided layoffs, a levy increase, and use of reserve funding. In order to achieve those goals, we made reductions to open FTEs and held positions vacant. As a result, the city is not staffed at pre-COVID full capacity. And we now know that this year in 2021, the City of St. Paul has incredible federal funding opportunities. The city will receive a direct allocation of $166.6 million from the American Rescue Plan. The first half of that will be coming in May 2021, maybe today or yesterday. And then the second half, 12 months from now. So for context, this amount exceeds the city's 2021 property tax levy, which is $165 million. The ARP also includes billions of dollars in other sources available to local governments, and we anticipate other federal legislation will bring continued resources. So in order for our residents to get the most federal resources possible into St. Paul, we believe the city needs to expand our staff capacity to manage and pursue these funding opportunities, as well as coordinate all the partnerships that will leverage all of our dollars to maximum benefit. And so we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Laura Logston, who will provide more detail on the federal funding.
Good morning. We wanted to start with just a little bit of context on the American Rescue Plan direct allocations. The ARP includes state and local fiscal recovery funds. And here's just a breakdown of how that $350 billion is being allocated to states, counties, metropolitan cities, territories, and non-entitlement units of government. St. Paul's direct allocation comes from the metropolitan cities allocation, that $45.6 billion. And then below here, we also have a list of all of the local ARP direct allocations that are in the Twin Cities metro area, including the state of Minnesota's $2.8 billion, Hennepin and Ramsey County, City of Minneapolis. Then you can see St. Paul. Also, the St. Paul Public Schools are receiving almost $207 million. Their direct allocation is not through the state and local fiscal recovery funds. Theirs is through the Department of Education and has a different formula and methodology for how their allocation is set. But we just wanted to give that kind of context of how many resources, how many dollars are actually coming into Minnesota and to our direct area. Like the deputy mayor and the council president said,
Ms. Logston, sorry to interrupt you, but before you move to this slide, if you could just bop back for a quick second.
Sure.
I'm curious, when you I'm imagining that some of the dollars that are have been allocated to the state, there'll be somewhat of a push-pull there, because if counties and if metropolitan cities receive dollars, then are those states resources earmarked for small cities, or I guess I don't know what non-entitlement units of local government mean. Is that smaller municipal cities, or I'm just wondering how much of that push-pull is going to happen because we got our own allocation.
Right, that's a great question. So the non-entitlement units of government are all of the cities that did not receive a direct allocation. So like St. Paul and Minneapolis received direct allocations because of our population. So every city in the US is receiving an allocation of ARP funds, but only cities of a certain size are getting their funds directly from the federal government. Cities below, I think it's below 50,000, are receiving their ARP allocation through their states. So the total like 195 billion that's to states, that's just for states. And then states are, my understanding is states are then going to get 19.5 billion that they have to allocate out to the small cities in their states.
Okay, so the 19.5 billion is above and beyond, specifically earmarked for the non-entitlement units of local government. And that's in addition to the 195.5 billion.
Correct. So the state of Minnesota's 2.8 billion listed here. My understanding is that does not include all of the funds that they're receiving to distribute out to the non-entitlement cities.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So next we wanted to just give some high-level information about the guidelines that did come out on Monday from the Treasury Department. Like the Deputy Mayor said, St. Paul is receiving $166.6 million. The deadlines, and this is something we're still digging into in the guidelines. At a high level, the deadline for the funds is December 31st, 2024. But it looks like in the guidelines, what they're saying is that the deadline for obligating funds is that date, and that we actually have until the end of 2026 to spend funds. We're still trying to understand what obligate means. And so that's something that we're digging into, but we think at a high level that means funds would need to be encumbered by the end of 2024. So like goods and services that we've purchased are encumbered. And then if the actual expense incurs beyond that, we have until 2026. But that's something we definitely still need to understand further. And it looks like there might be a question.
With Council President's permission, thanks, Laura. I'm just curious, and I'm sure this isn't deeper in the guidelines too, but do we know what final spending means? In other words, if we allocate the dollars, say, to a nonprofit partner to do some work, is that spent, or is it only once those dollars have then left that nonprofit and gone out to an individual's hands, is that spent?
That's a great question. I think that's something that we need to dig in to understand further. With the CARES funds, I think our experience was once the city had spent the funds, like if we had a contract with a nonprofit and we provided the funds to that nonprofit, that meant the funds were spent. But I think we need to dig into that to better understand.
All right. Just a quick question. Who is operating the PowerPoint? Is that you, Laura, or someone else?
Yes, that's me.
Okay, I want to move a couple of folks from presenter to attendee just so I can keep a better eye on hands up. So I just want to make sure I didn't move the wrong person. Thank you for that. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. At a high level, the purpose of the ARP funds is to support the immediate pandemic response, bring back jobs, and lay the groundwork for a strong and equitable recovery. So those, at a high level, that's going to be what we need to tie all of our uses back to. The guidelines also outline reporting requirements. It looks like the city is going to be required to submit quarterly reports as well as an annual report. Our first quarterly report and our first annual report look like they're due August 31st of this year. So again, those are details we're going to need to really dig into to understand what's being required of us. It looks like reporting, is going to include financial information and data, also some outcome measurements and metrics that the federal government is going to set, but then also it looks like that they're going to expect all the recipients to be setting certain outcome measurements as well. So just to give everybody an update on kind of what that reporting structure looks like. Next, we wanted to get into some of the eligible and ineligible uses. At a high level, the key sort of categories of eligibility are supporting public health expenditures, addressing the negative economic impacts caused by the pandemic, serving the hardest hit communities and families. This particular category looks like it also has some specific requirements of like how those communities are defined by certain like census tracts. So, that's something we need to dig into as well. Replacing lost public sector revenue. This one, the guidelines have provided, it looks like a pretty detailed formula of how do we calculate revenue loss. So that's something that finance staff are looking into in more detail now as well to understand what that means for us. But it does look like they've provided some pretty good guidance on how to calculate revenue loss. We can provide premium pay for essential workers, and those are defined. It's not just like city essential workers, it's farm workers, grocery store, food production, nursing home staff. So there's a broad range of essential workers defined in the guidance. And then also the last major category is investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Some of the ineligible uses that are outlined, the two really key ones that we've known about from, since the law was passed was we cannot use funds to offset a revenue reduction from offsetting a reduction in net tax revenue. So any changes to taxes that occurred since March 3rd of this year, we would not be able to use revenue to offset those reductions. We also cannot make deposits into pension funds, and they define that as, I believe it was extraordinary deposits into pension funds. So anything that is out of the ordinary. It also looks like we cannot use these funds to cover debt service, legal settlements or judgments, any deposits into our reserves or rainy day funds, or general infrastructure. That's like a pretty nuanced area, though, that we still need to better understand because of the ability to use these funds to invest in water, sewer, and broadband. There might be other ways to make infrastructure investments connected to those types of investments. But I know this infrastructure in particular is an area that a lot of communities were thinking about for ARP funds. So I think that's also something that we're seeing a lot of questions bubbling up from cities and communities across the country about that. So that's something we want to better understand. And we're participating in a lot of webinars with the White House and with national organizations this week. So we're hoping to get some of those big questions answered more too. And then we also just wanted to lay out again at a very high level the different federal funding opportunities that we're seeing within the American Rescue Plan and then beyond the American Rescue Plan. So all of these ARP resources that we've listed here, a lot of them have competitive grant opportunities, and those are resources that we really want to be able to go after to maximize the city's effectiveness, like the deputy mayor said, in bringing federal resources to the St. Paul community. We've also gotten started on the House and Senate appropriation earmark process and transportation and infrastructure earmark process and have over $30 million kind of on a pathway for St. Paul. And we've also listed here the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan as potential other resources. So having this environment of just a huge amount of federal funding that we know is already coming to the city and is out there that the city could be going after is a really motivating factor for us in being able to build up our staffing capacity to maximize these sources and to manage what we have and to pursue other sources. So I'm going to turn it over to Director McCarthy next.
Thank you, Laura, as I remind myself to come off mute here. So yeah, as Laura just laid out, you know, to use a technical finance term, there's a boatload of funding that's out there right now, and we are really wanting to make sure that we're well positioned to take advantage of all of these federal funding opportunities. We've been mostly talking about that 166 million in direct aid, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's available for us right now. So as we think about timing and process, again, as Laura noted, we've already have over $182 million available to us right now between the direct ARP aid and the 2 rounds of emergency rental assistance funding. And in process, we're tracking, you know, about $33 million of potential funding in the House and Senate earmark and T&I processes, including, you know, funding for radios, the Randolph Avenue Bridge, the Kellogg River Center Bridge, and the 3rd Street Kellogg Bridge. We know that there's over $60 billion in competitive federal funding that we need to be well positioned to compete for, and we're also looking to opportunities to partner with you know, our colleagues at St. Paul Public Schools, at Ramsey County, and state agencies, which combined opens up another, you know, $3.6 billion in funding opportunities for the city. And you know, we also need to be well prepared for the possibility of you know, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan potentially funding. So again, to take full advantage of these opportunities, we need a strategy, a process, and a team. And I think the success that we've had already so far in the earmark process is a great example of why having a team and a strategy in place is so important. We were really quick to put together that team, and we got strong proposals submitted on that tight earmark timeline. And that was one that we put together without you know, the same kind of like advanced notice that we have now for ARP. So that was something that we were a little bit reactive and still were able to put together a really solid team and learned a lot of lessons from that experience. Can you go to the next slide, please? So with that in mind, and all these opportunities on the table, we, you know, and that specific recent success we had in the earmark process, we've been working through a needs assessment to address staffing gaps and what our needs would be to put together a proposed federal funding team. That team, as we've kind of laid out here at a high level, would build capacity to best position St. Paul to secure these federal resources for all the different high priority projects that we have in the pipeline. In putting this team together, we looked at gaps that came up during the CARES grant process, and we looked to other governments for example. So I looked at Minneapolis, Ramsey County, and others to get ideas on what this would look like. What we learned from that experience is that lots of governments already have teams like this in place, just as part of their kind of standard operating teams to be able to leverage federal opportunities and state opportunities every year. And you know, we had really kind of key experience during CARES to identify some of the gaps that we had within the city. So the team that we've proposed here would manage the high-level strategy work around our federal funding strategy, would manage work across departments and coordinate with external partners. And it would also build out internal processes, including grant management and compliance, the subrecipient monitoring, legal analysis and review, and procurement and contracting. And I see that there's a question here, so I can pause for a second.
All right, Ms. Prince.
Yeah, and I don't want to too quickly react, but I appreciate the need for staffing up to prepare for all of this, but I'm wondering if we have looked carefully at reassigning of staff or redeploying of staff that are maybe not in as essential of roles. So I hope we're looking at that.
Councilmember Prince, Council President Bremnon, that's a great question, and I think what we're trying to do right now is identify the needs, and I think you're right in that there are folks in the city who have a lot of great expertise and experience in this work where we would want to slot them into those roles. Ms. Logsden from my team is one of those people who's been working on the CARES grant and is now taken on a lead role in the ARP role. We envision that there's lots of other folks within the city who would be eligible for these places. And I think what we're trying to identify is the team and the needs and slot the right people in as we go through the kind of hiring process. And there's going to be some places where those people would be able to absorb this work, and other places where we would need to backfill for those folks. And that's right now, again, we're trying to identify the full needs and put the team together, and then think to where we can redeploy people and where they need to be backfilled and where we would need to look to external hiring. But it's a key point, and right, we've got lots of great experts within the city for sure. So just touching back on that, that kind of internal process area, that is sort of the back office functions. Those again are areas that we really noticed during the CARES process that we were light in the city, and it's not only meaning that we're potentially leaving money on the table, but it's also putting ourselves at risk with the federal compliance process. So this team would also envision including specialized consultants in some key areas where there are substantial funding opportunities, and they also tend to have really complicated application processes and things like transportation, housing, and economic development, where we've seen there's huge opportunities for grants. But again, those are really complex areas that we might need specialized help. See if there's another question.
Looks like Ms. Naker has a question.
Thanks, Council President. Thanks, Mr. McCarthy. I appreciate Councilmember Prince's questions. I'm sure we all want to be as prudent and fiscally responsible as possible with this. I am wondering, how does the size of this team compare to other teams that maybe Ramsey County or St. Paul Public Schools or other local governments are bringing together? I just want to see if we're comparable. And then my second question, I want to make sure we're looking really closely at our federal lobbying help and making sure that that our consultants there are up to the task. I know you mentioned earmarks, and I believe that information about when that process was going to begin was not something that was forthcoming from our federal consultants. It was something we sort of found out around the grapevine. And so I just want to make sure that as we move into this much more competitive process with a lot more opportunities, that we have the help we need to not ever drop the ball on anything.
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Naker, for the first half of your question, I think this is pretty comparable to the size of the county's team, which is one that we looked at most directly. The county put their team together for CARES because they got substantially more funding than we did through CARES and got a direct allocation from the federal government, where ours was a pass-through through the state. So they have a great team built out and have been super helpful to us in giving us kind of their play-by-play and documents that they use for helping their teams manage these processes. So that's been a great partnership, and we'll continue to look to them for help as we go through this. The second part of your question, I see Deputy Mayor came off mute, so I'll turn it over to Deputy Mayor Tinter to respond to that one.
I would say our federal partners, we work really closely with Primacy through the earmark process. Ryan Kelly and Emily Tranter, who have worked with the city for a number of years, they've been actually phenomenal through the earmark process. I think what Director McCarthy was referencing was that at the federal level, the earmarks came very quickly to everybody. So I think everybody was sort of scrambling with earmarks that came back all of a sudden at the federal level. But they have been really, really good to work with. What we did at the city was scrambled a team of directors, subject matter experts, partnering with council members to sort of bring our city team in alignment with prioritizing projects, getting the information pulled together. And so they were very beneficial to that. What we also did was Melanie McMahon shifted into the role of sort of coordinating that work within the city. And that was really the role and the function that was most beneficial to that process, was just being able to have somebody that was dedicated in those days to pulling all of that data and the information and the meetings together. So, and then as part of this, we have talked with our federal partners about adding additional lobbying support and some consultant support that they work with. So expanding their contract to meet all of these needs as well.
So as we look to that total cost estimate, I think this is a conservative estimate of about $2.9 million in annual cost for this team, which equates to about 6% of our direct ARP aid. For some perspective, with large federal grants, we typically dedicate about 10% to administrative costs. I think it's also really important to note that as that total amount of federal funding we receive increases over that 166 million in direct aid, this administrative percentage would actually go down. So we're looking for this team to go beyond just that 166 million in direct aid and secure and manage as much federal funding as we possibly can. So, and in fact, if you add on the emergency rental assistance money that we already have lined up, this actually drops to about 5.5%. And so, the way I see it, this team's goal should be to get that administrative percentage as low as possible by securing as much, outside funding to the city as possible.
I agree. And I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the kind of putting it in perspective. I know, it's 5 or 6% administrative cost is actually very modest. And like, for example, nonprofits, 15 to 20% is what is used as a benchmark for whether or not you should give to a nonprofit. Granted, this isn't a nonprofit, and I do think that leveraging our existing staff to the extent possible is great. But I do think that if we're fully staffed and able to leverage this $166 million to bring in, twice as much dollars, looking at, when you were going through the broadband development, housing, human services, there wasn't just millions and billions we were talking about trillions. I just don't recall ever hearing trillions in terms of allocated pots of money. So to the extent that we are on top of it, getting in there, leveraging the resources in our projects that we're doing to get even more dollars. This council has talked endlessly about the travesty of previous administrations kicking the maintenance can down the road, and just the load that is upon us that we simply can't ignore any longer. And so, I think that in some ways these are the dollars that have been withheld and that we have had to kind of strangle ourselves for in the past. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness here. I think it is relatively modest, as I said in the beginning, and I think that what you just said at the end of your statement, Mr. McCarthy, is also any money in addition that we are able to leverage through having us a well-oiled machine here also reduces the overall expenditure percentage. So I appreciate that as well.
Thank you. And next slide, please. So in terms of process, we're kicking off our typical budget process for 2022 right now, and we're having, the normal conversations about resource constraints and limited resources like property taxes and local government aid. And at the same time, we're working on how we will overlay ARP funding and all the other funding opportunities into that process. We're envisioning that those will happen in tandem and will allow for several opportunities for the council to review and participate in this process. As we noted, we just got the guidelines for ARP direct aid on Monday, and we still don't actually have funds in hand yet. So we're still building out this process to some degree. We've laid out kind of a high-level timeline on what that process could look like here. Starting with the federal earmarking process that, the first phase of which we've already kicked off. And, the council reviewed and approved those proposals before the city submitted them to Representative McCollum's office. We're working through that funds transfer process to get the direct aid sent to the city. We have to see who draws the short straw and submits their social security number and driver's license to the Treasury before we can get that money. But we anticipate, that's a new wrinkle this year. We anticipate accepting those resources and amending the budget at the May 26th City Council meeting, so coming up here in a couple weeks. Then, from there, we'd leverage the city's annual budget process, and we've got infrastructure built out in the city budget process that is key that would be able to take advantage of. First, we have a community engagement process that we could layer on ARP as part of that engagement. We also have the infrastructure built out to have departments working together and within their own department to submit budget proposals. So we will use that timeline and that process to review ARP and other funding opportunity proposals from departments. From that work, we know we're going to identify some immediate needs that we would look to fund right away outside of the budget process. And those are proposals that we would look to review with the city council and then amend the budget at regular council meetings for kind of priority immediate funding. And, you know, we have some key examples of that we've already reviewed with you at the first org meeting related to ARP. From that work, we also will establish work groups in some key policy areas to fully flesh out proposals. And we have some key examples of areas where those types of groups are already in place and, you know, doing key service work. And we'd layer on ARP and other federal you know, asks as part of those service areas. We'd, you know, envision also adding additional work groups to that, to those streams as well. And then for the longer term funding proposals, you know, those that would take time to plan and build out, we'd look to including them in the 2022 proposed budget, which would be released in the middle of August. I'm going to turn it back now to Deputy Mayor Tincher to outline in more detail some of the immediate needs and work groups that have already been identified.
Thank you, John. I'll pause before I go into this part of it and just see if folks have questions on this. Really, what I was going to try to lay out is for discussion, sort of how we see the flow between, you know, if we have immediate needs that we need to jump on, and how that would sort of dovetail with things that we could spend more time through work group processes and embed into the budget. And the work that we've been doing to support our unsheltered residents is a good example of formation of a work group, and it has some immediate needs that we'd like to move forward with, but then also use the budget process for really building that whole proposal out. But if folks need to ask questions or discuss, I can hold on that.
Sure. And I apologize, I misspoke earlier. I see Ms. Jalali is actually in the house today, so I will go to her for a question.
No problem. I think I came on right as you were given the preamble. Yeah, I actually, I'll wait, Deputy Mayor, for you to get through the immediate needs. My brief comment closing out Mr. McCarthy's last section is that I would really encourage us all to think about how can we increase community engagement to shape how we use these funds. And I'm thinking of comparable work experiences I've had where for annual congressional appropriations, organizations and groups would write letters and submit requests to be considered. And I just think that in addition to us thinking about how to overlay this with our current city engagement process around the budget, which is, I think, a good natural container, I would be really interested in shaping even more engagement beyond that. And then I don't think that most groups in our community have had to live through a pandemic and have had to like think about how to advocate for one-time massive funding before. And so even though I know a lot of groups in our community do funding for advocacy in an ongoing way, I think the process around this isn't necessarily inviting for an average group to then be able to say, hey, we'd really like to volunteer some insight into what we think are really deep and urgent needs in our community right now. And I think that knowledge would shape really well how we can direct these funds in a really community-centered way. And I think that, you know, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And I don't think that there'd be a ton of disagreement with this group, but I wanted to just reinforce that point. I think that's going to be really critical. Thank you.
Mr. Tolbert and then Ms. Naker.
Yeah, I just want to say, just for feedback, I think this is the right direction. I like the organization that's being brought to this. I think first and foremost, it's really important that we collaborate with our other partners to make sure that we're not being duplicative and that we're leveraging each other's goals and resources simultaneously. The other part about hiring to be able to compete, one of the things I think is really important is, you know, we're getting the 166 million allocated to the city, and that's going to be fantastic. But if and when these other allocations come down from the federal government, whether it's for infrastructure, for housing, or for jobs, or what other programs they have. I think we have an obligation, and we should compete to get those resources into St. Paul. And I think the best way to do that is to be prepared to compete for it. And so I like the addition of specialists and people who can focus on this, because especially after last year with the budget that we had to deal with, I know city staff are very stretched thin, and we should have people who focus on competing for these potential funds, whether it's streets or replacement of ash board trees or affordable housing grants. We should be able to compete for those with other communities, because we know other cities and other states will be competing as well. So as much as we can bring back to St. Paul, I'm supportive of. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness of this, and look forward to continuing to work with you guys on it.
Thank you, Mr. Tolbert. Ms. Naker.
Thanks, Council President, and thanks again, Deputy Mayor and Director McCarthy. I also, kind of going back to the previous slide, I would just really encourage us that whatever process we end up using to decide how to spend the funds, that we continue to think about the American Rescue Plan dollars as their own separate tool. I just don't want us to lose sight of the fact that this is such an incredible opportunity for our city. It could really be a game changer if we spend it, if we focus those funds on some really top priorities. And I worry about our budget process, not only as Councilmember Jalali mentioned, because it has a different community engagement flow and it may not focus people's attention on it if it just seems like the budget. But also to Councilmember Tolbert's point, if we're trying to coordinate with all of these other bodies that are getting their own allocations of ARP dollars, I don't know that the budget process gives us that opportunity to be thoughtful that way. So I don't want us to let this huge opportunity kind of slip away in dribs and drabs into each of the departments without some sort of focus on what we're achieving with it. So I just want to keep that in mind as we design the process for these specific dollars.
Thank you. Mr. Tolbert, did you have a follow-up comment, or is your hand just still up? Nope.
Sorry.
Always want to make sure. All right, it doesn't look like there's questions outstanding at this time. So let's turn it back to you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Council President. And Councilmember Naker, point really well taken. That, and I would add to that, not just the ARP dollars, but all of those federal opportunities. We would be missing a really big opportunity if we didn't laser focus on some really key priorities that would really advance where we want to go for the city of St. Paul. And so I think, as I talk about one of those priorities, just supporting our residents experiencing homelessness, the way that we've approached that work and the groups that have informed that, you co-chair alongside with me, I think it's a good example of how we can build out around those key priorities that we have, how the city of St. Paul is really focused on those, building out work groups and figuring out which funding sources are going to advance those objectives most effectively right now. So on this slide, 3 immediate needs that we've discussed previously are the street teams that we partnered with the Downtown Alliance to have, as well as increased patrols by SPPD in key areas of downtown as we all collaborate on reopening businesses, work sites, recreational and public spaces to create a welcoming and safe environment for all. We've discussed additional support to St. Paul Ramsey County Domestic Abuse Intervention Project because we all know that the pandemic has increased the need for services and support to victims experiencing domestic abuse. An additional immediate need that I wanted to discuss today is the continued work to support our residents experiencing homelessness. In response to the pandemic, we pulled many staff into the work of supporting our residents experiencing homelessness, and we'd like to shift to a more sustainable model for that work. Last year, 2 action plans framed the city's initial response to the rise in individuals experiencing homelessness in our community because of COVID. Number 1, finding long-term and permanent options to serve our unsheltered population. And number 2, responding to the immediate needs of individuals living in encampments, in the woods, in caves, and under bridges. Driven by our commitment to support the safety and health of residents experiencing homelessness, the city worked at an intense pace throughout the fall and winter, collaborating with Ramsey County and service providers to assure substantial new shelter space was available and ready for occupancy. Key needs that were identified through a survey of homeless individuals and outreach service providers were low barrier shelter space and more options for women, youth, LGBTQ, living single room living occupations, and day shelter space. The results included an expanded safe space, overnight emergency shelter, transformation of Bethesda Hospital into Bethesda Shelter in St. Paul, reoccupancy of Mary Hall as a downtown overnight men's shelter, and converting Stube Hall at Luther Seminary to a shelter serving women and couples. Freedom House on West 7th Street was activated to serve as a daytime drop-in and referral center for individuals experiencing homelessness. We diligently worked to knock down barriers we encountered while managing this challenging work. We now offer storage for individuals' belongings when an encampment is closed. Items are stored for up to 60 days, and our team delivers belongings as requested in that 60-day window. We also provide transportation to shelter space during the day and to overnight shelter whenever we encounter a resident who is seeking shelter. As a direct result, we moved from a historic high of 380 people living in encampments in the summer and fall of 2020, again, driven largely by the pandemic, to an average of 50 individuals living in sites throughout the city over the past few months. Most sites have only 1 or 2 occupants, which is similar to pre-pandemic levels of unsheltered homelessness in our community. If we go to the next slide, after closing approximately 40 unique encampments over the past several months, St. Paul is in a very different position than this time last year. Many people have utilized new shelter space, and on any given day, there are still about 50 beds available in shelters. Moving forward, we're committed to keeping previously closed encampment areas cleared and helping people get into available shelter spaces and ultimately housing. We're intentionally aligning this work with our area action plan work, specifically with our downtown partners as we collaborate on reopening businesses and work sites and spaces to create a welcoming and safe environment for all. City leaders now sit on the Ramsey County Continuum of Care Steering Committee and Governing Board. Informed by our experiences over the last year, we'll be in a stronger position to engage in systems change, including funding allocations for shelter space, operations, supportive services, and supportive housing options. The American Rescue Plan funds will play a critical role in the next 2 years by supporting our strategies in alignment with the continuum of care. We're focused on getting people sheltering outdoors into shelters as a first step, but also building capacity to support longer-term, affordable, and supportive permanent housing investments for all who choose to live in our city. We do not believe that sheltering in homeless encampments in the woods, in caves, or under bridges provides safe, healthy, or secure living environments. Encampments are emblematic of significant system shortcomings, and we can and must continue to do better. We would recommend that St. Paul moves forward now to start the process of hiring a dedicated, experienced, culturally competent, ideally with lived experience city team to support residents experiencing unsheltered homelessness. At a high level, that would be a response team and DSI to provide dedicated services that includes street outreach and individual level relationship building work, development of a by name registry of individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness in the city of St. Paul, initiating and securing shelter referrals, connecting individuals for mental and chemical health assessments, conducting encampment safety assessments, and managing encampment needs. The lead position within that team would also serve as the city's technical expert in unsheltered homelessness work, providing direction to the field team, but would also serve as a policy expert and advocate for the city in this workspace. Right now, that role has basically been filled by the deputy director in the Department of Safety and Inspections, and adding this position would allow us to move him back into the role that he was hired to do. We'd also recommend that the St. Paul Parks Department hire a dedicated abatement crew whose primary role would be responding to encampment requests. This work can be done with contractors, but it's not our recommended strategy because hiring a dedicated abatement crew would allow us to improve the service delivery, because we could develop a team that would bring that cultural and linguistic competence and ideally lived experience to this work. That team would also be able to facilitate the the storage services work that needs to be done. We would recommend funding for this project initially be supported through the use of American Rescue Act dollars. However, our team is committed to working to secure grants or identify other better funding matches for this continued work. Additionally, this work aligns with the Heading Home Ramsey continuum of care and the county's mission in this work. So as we would implement this team, we would, and as the work evolves, we'd be well positioned to determine the right ongoing sustainable staffing and investments post 2022. And if we go to the next slide.
Ms. Tincher, I
Yep.
do see a lot of folks with hands up maybe, and I want to make sure that you get through what you're talking about, maybe to preempt some of the questions, but I do see several hands up, and I know I have a question about the team you're proposing. So can we pause you for just a sec?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, my question was just, have we done any considering of the response team you're talking about? In some ways, as you were describing it, seemed like it might be a better fit in St. Paul Ramsey County Public Health. Has there been any consideration to that end? I mean, there is that natural overlap under that department, and I'm just curious, just given the overlap in the work, if that has been considered.
Yes, and I think we would be open to that. I think maybe if I go to the last slide, and I'll do it really quickly, and then I could come back to the question.
Sure. Well, and let's just do that if this is the last slide, and then I do see Ms. Naker and Ms. Jalali both have a hand up as well. But if it will help to get to the end of your presentation, and then we'll bop back to questions, that'd be great.
So on this last slide, I wanted to just kind of lay out that there is a work group. So the Heading Home Ramsey Continuum of Care established a work group to advance the goal of deploying rapid response teams. And Councilmember Naker and I agreed to support that effort by co-leading that group. And this list of individuals comes from a wide array of organizations and expertise in working in this space. And they've agreed to help us develop a plan for rapid response teams, and also, what programming or services can we either tap into, augment, create if necessary, to effectively address the needs of our frequent users of emergency services and sort of those high need individuals. This group, beginning on April 15th, St. Paul was invited to participate in an 8-week collaborative through What Works Cities, where the CAHOOTS program and other response models around behavioral health, addiction, poverty, and homelessness related public safety efforts. They are leading a What Works City Solutions sprint titled Compassionate Emergency Response, Exploring Innovative Local Approaches to Public Safety. And so they brought us together. This whole group on this slide was invited, and they've been participating in those sessions. And we're going to meet next week to determine next steps and confirm a process for advancing all of that work around what do we need in our region for rapid response teams, as well as additional services for frequent users of emergency services. And so if I go back to sort of the situation we're in, where we have a lot of federal funding opportunities, we're transitioning from a response to work that was responding to an emergency toward how do we want to respond ongoing and sustainably. The recommendation would be that we add key staff positions so that we can transition staff in the city that during the pandemic were assigned to this work, so that they can transition back and we can sort of level out what that work flow is. But we know from the work that we've done, if we're going to stay on top of managing encampments and supporting individuals getting into services and resources, having that capacity to do that relationship building and that street outreach work is really important. And we also now know that having a by name registry, where for the 45 individuals this week that we know are on the streets, knowing who they are, what their needs are, where they are in their path towards supports is really how we can effectively not have encampment situations like we did last year. So I'll stop there. I know there are a ton of questions.
Yes. Just a couple. I see Ms. Naker and then Ms. Jalali have hands up.
Thanks, Council President. And Deputy Mayor, I wanted to first and foremost commend you and your team for the leadership that you're showing on this. I have had the pleasure of working with you on this for a number of months now, and I really appreciate the way that you are looking at this issue. I think we're taking it both from an immediate urgency, needing to get people into shelter triage perspective, and also at the same time keeping in mind the longer term systemic issues that I think things like the continuum of care, the What Works Cities model, those innovative approaches, looking for best practices elsewhere to really get at the core issue, which is helping those who are most in need that frankly no other city or community has figured out. I think our city is leading on this. We heard in a conversation you and I were in just the other day, we were being very favorably compared to a city to our west in terms of how we are handling this. And so I think everything about this approach makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm very supportive of investing so that our director of the Department of Safety and Inspections, as one example, can get back to his other job. There is so much other work that he needs to do and that our team needs to do, that our parks director needs to do, that so many others on supporting small businesses and keeping our parks beautiful and open. I mean, a lot of that work has been diverted to this work, and it shouldn't be. So I think this investment helps us get back to that balance. But I do want to second what Council President Brenmoen said. It's ultimately the county needs to be a equal or more than equal partner in this work. And I want to make sure that I think we can see them represented on this slide, but I want to make sure financially too, that they are really pulling their weight when it comes to this effort.
Great, thanks. I know I wrote down and underlined the American Rescue Plan dollars that Ramsey County also received and can pay, use immediately as well to help support this work. So thank you for that. Ms. Jalali.
Thank you. I would echo the appreciation for the progress made, and I wanted to ask whether and how you all see what would you say is the plan or initial thinking around creating and mapping needs for like interim and supportive and more permanent housing as part of this strategy? I think that what I see right now reflects a lot of the work that I know that's been happening. It makes sense that it's under immediate needs because it sort of is a way to route dollars to the operation we already have and what we know the gaps are. I do think a part of that we've talked about a lot in many settings before this is how to create places for folks to live in a way that is even looking at opportunity around the city where there's empty sites, empty buildings, things that the city could look at, taking into ownership so that we can have more assets. That's something that I'd love to hear some initial thinking around, and if there's a plan to engage the council and the community around that part of this effort.
Absolutely. Council President, Councilmember Jalali, my recommendation would be, I think that for that body of work at our housing, long-term permanent housing strategies, we need a work group similar to the one that we just laid out for this immediate need. Our housing director and PED should be included, many other members of the city staff, but a lot of people with expertise in our community that could come together and form a work group and say, okay, we have all federal funding opportunities. We have all of these partners funding that we should leverage on top of each other toward a goal of increasing the housing that we need to meet the need. And I know that the Heading Home continuum of care, I think that there is some work that has already been started in that space with some work groups and some thinking, but we can augment that through how we approach all of these federal opportunities at this moment.
Thank you.
I would like to be on that.
Yeah, I think I'd be eager to be there, and I appreciate that. I think this is a conversation we'll keep coming back to because I do personally believe it is what gets us out of the cycle. The just community energy and goodwill too around working to come together to create things like indoor villages. And I don't love the phrase tiny homes, but I understand the concept, and just all kinds of housing that would actually help folks in the immediate term. And it's also an immediate need. I will personally admit I feel a little jarred seeing like right on the first slide SPPD as the immediate need area. I think that we need to be thoughtful about how we're balancing where we're getting all these resources out to, and I trust that we'll be able to partner on that. So thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Jalali. I see Ms. Prince with a hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Council President Brenmon, and thank you, Deputy Mayor. I will second what everybody has said. I think all the comments about this particular discussion are ones that I agree with, that I think the city stepped in under your amazing leadership to really push the way that I've always thought of the housing issues and the homelessness issues is that the county is responsible for the shelter side, the human services side, and the city is responsible on the supply side. And what happened over the last year and a half or so that you have been working on this is that you jumped in where the county was not having success and really pushed to provide the shelter options that were needed, the dignified shelter options that were needed. I mean, it really has been extraordinary, along with the wraparound services and the meals. And so I cannot thank you enough for providing that leadership and creating a model that is actually working. And then I do need to say that I think it's time for the county to take responsibility for seeing that that continues and that that works. And if we need to be part of transitioning that back, I'm good with that. But I do think it's time now, as Ms. Jalali said, for us to really be focusing on creating permanent housing options. And I know you agree with that. You and I talked about it last week, Deputy Mayor, about we now have the opportunity with the federal funding coming in to figure out what the permanent solutions are to the homelessness problem. And so I'm going to say something about that and about the American Rescue Plan money that I think gets to something that Ms. Naker said, which is I'm very concerned about us looking at the American Rescue Plan money through the budgeting process, or as, you know, having our departments figure out what needs are. I really feel, and I would really like to see us do something along the lines of what the county is doing, which is to commit a certain percentage off the top of the American Rescue Plan dollars to some of these larger needs, like housing. I think that if we don't do that, we're going to miss a significant opportunity, whether it's to take 30% off the top, if it's to decide what our 2 or 3 largest priorities are as a city, and being able to pull some of that money out of the work that we're doing so that we can really focus on needs that we have not been able to focus on for decades. I mean, the presentation started, this is a once in a generation opportunity. I believe it's at least a generation. And so my recommendation, both in addressing the homelessness issue, is that we get to the permanent housing side of preventing homelessness, and that we take a significant chunk of this money off the top to dedicate to housing, which is, I would argue, our city's greatest need.
Thank you, Ms. Prince. I will say, I know Ms. Yang has a hand up, but just one thing that I thought was very a good reminder at the beginning of this presentation as well is, we're talking about some immediate funding priorities, and then, but also, if we do have an opportunity, to your point, Ms. Prince, to be strategic about, our overall strategy for using our ARP dollars, especially given that that these are dollars that need to be spent by 2024, are encumbered by 2024 and spent by 2026. So while I think that urgency is there is also time to be strategic and planful as well. And that was helpful, thinking today. We've been under kind of duress with CARES dollars, like we have to spend them tomorrow. And in this case, we have an opportunity to take care of some things that are literally on fire today, and then be planful and knit our decision making in with other funded municipal or levels of government. And the other thing I was kind of saying a bit tongue in cheek the other day, but is we don't want to be too efficient and be the first ones out of the gate and fund things that maybe other entities would. So I think really being planful and working in partnership with those other levels of government is important as well. Ms. Yang.
Thanks, Council President. I do have input and questions, but I really like to see what else is on the PowerPoint. And looking at the time, we have like less than half an hour, and we've only gotten through a couple of slides. So is there more to share from the PowerPoint?
I believe that was the end.
Yep, that was
okay. So I will share my piece then. I am wondering, well, first off, I really want to echo what Councilmember Jalali shared about community engagement. One of the reasons why I think that's really important is because as I look at what was shared to us, I really feel there's an absence of input from especially our Black and Brown communities and organizations, like to increase funding for St. Paul Police Department patrols, and to have that be under like a slide where we're talking about homelessness. I think is really, it doesn't address, the needs that people who are experiencing homelessness need. When we talk about safety, it's about making sure that people have the most basic resources they need in order to be able to thrive in our communities. And if you go and talk to organizations that are working around homelessness, more policing, or should I say over policing, is not one of those immediate needs. So I'd like to really see that changed in the PowerPoint here, and would be more than happy to be a part of that conversation. I really feel like within work groups, if we could add in community leaders to be a part of that, that would be a significant way in which we can include community voices to be a part of this. In addition to that, the funding here is one huge criteria is making sure that it serves communities that have been marginalized and impacted directly by COVID-19. And when I think of all 3 zip codes in my ward, all of those zip codes fall under the heavily targeted areas for vaccination because they have been because they are medically underserved and also have barriers to technology and language. And that's why even at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds, all 3 of those zip codes, along with many other ones in St. Paul too, were a part of the heavily targeted zip codes for people to go get vaccinated. And so I really like to see the money, a plan around how we engage community organizations and leaders, because the money here is really people's money. And so how do we make sure that it gets to them? Like, that's one of my biggest priorities, and really would like to see that be what we center the funds here around. Because I know that we have a lot of competing priorities. However, there are a lot of organizations right now that do the work to meet the gaps of government, that, the things that we're not even able to do or haven't even thought of. Other community groups are doing that, and their highest need right now is money, so they can continue doing their work or bringing on people to help lead that work as well. So those are the things that I wanted to share right off the bat here, and would be more than happy to hear reactions to it, or, hear the plan around that as well.
Council President, Councilmember Yang, so for the work group on this, for the long term, how are we approaching rapid response teams, not just for St. Paul, but for all of Ramsey County, as well as where are the gaps for folks who are still struggling, that we are not serving them in our current shelter and other systems. That work, we are partnering through the Ramsey County Continuum of Care, which has a broad membership of community support. So what I would recommend, and what I'm trying to recommend in this, is that we separate out some immediate needs that we see, move forward with those that are unique to St. Paul so that we can respond, but then work in that partnership and in those spaces to develop out what are the long-term plans, and where are those community voices, where are those partners, those service providers that we work with. You'll see in that slide, we work really closely with Listening House, Safe Space, Catholic Charities, People's Inc., all of those members. And I think that the continuum of care, certainly as it was redesigned, the goal there is really to tap into, for this work, the community voices and have that be a space where we're bringing that thinking. So we're committed to working through that space for those efforts. What I will say about the immediate need around St. Paul Police, I personally fully support the work that our police department is doing right now in this space. For the services that we needed to provide in order to respond to the dramatic increase in need that we had, spaces like the day space that we're offering on West 7th, there are impacts to the community when we add a space where we are serving individuals who are in need. There just are. And the way that we have responded to that is we've said, we are committed to serving the individuals that we need to be serving. And we're committed to offering that space where they can go and have radical hospitality and get services and connections and all of those pieces. The neighbors do experience challenges. And so our police department, what I will say is that they have stepped into this space with a whole lot of compassion, with a whole lot of understanding, with a lot of training. Things that don't get a lot of attention and they don't get the headlines are when we had an individual who was in crisis, fire a gun twice right outside of a squad car. Our officer got out, de-escalated that situation, and no one was injured. Everyone walked away from that. And we have police officers that are in that space where we need to have that presence. They are on foot. They are responding really smartly to exactly the service that we do need to respond to. They are not the full answer, and St. Paul has never had the approach that that we will arrest our way out of this, or that criminalizing homelessness is the way to go, and that is absolutely not how our police department is approaching it. But the additional support we need from them, I will support and advocate for those resources and that work every day.
Thanks, Ms. Fincher. And just a bit of a just a reminder to folks that we're scheduled for the ARP update really till 11 today. We have a closed door session that we requested that follows this meeting. So unlike a typical org committee meeting, we don't have the 11:30 plus time. So I want to make sure we get to our questions and on this update and kind of next steps.
And council member for the or council president and council members for the work advancing in the unsheltered space, really what we're looking for is we feel like we need to start the process of sort of reallocating city staff and hiring. But Councilmember Naker is sort of the co-chair with me on all of these. And so I know that she's a resource outside of this meeting, and we can come back and have conversations before we would advance specific dollars that would be advanced.
All right, so we're talking, this is basically a proposal out to includes the plan that you've outlined here today as part of our immediate needs ARP dollars. And that it sounds like it's still a bit underway, but this is the bones of a plan, and you'll be back to us with a final proposal in terms of what that looks like. And I also heard from the council, great, we love it. We're proud of our leadership and kind of innovative work here. And we want to make sure that our partner in Ramsey County is participating at the levels that are appropriate, especially given that they also have received this influx of dollars, and that really in many ways these are jobs that are their roles. And my thought in addition to that was, is there a place in public health where these knit together naturally that it would fit? Okay, so the other thing, the other thing I want to be sure about is that we talked a little bit about work groups and plans, and if you could touch a little bit, I know the council is interested in engaging in work groups. There are obviously different folks have different interests. We're talking about strategy, and I think that the other thing is, Mr. McCarthy touched on this briefly, but the way this is shaping up in my head is that this American Rescue Plan dollars are sort of like a foundation that is has specific rules and regulations and obligations around it. And if we're managing our foundation as a council and administration, that it is wise for us to determine what our priorities are. And those would be what we would fund with these dollars. Obviously, even in a foundation, sometimes, small items get funded that aren't necessarily in direct alignment. But I really like the idea of, to the extent possible, keeping these dollars separate from our regular budget process and then bringing them in to amend our budget on a piece by piece basis, which is a bit of work, but I think that helps us kind of separate one-time dollars from ongoing funding. And I'm seeing nodding from at least some of my colleagues, but just as we're mapping this out, I think just to be clear, what does that process look like, and know that there is some interest in really being able to identify those separate American Rescue Plan dollars and how we're spending them, and not have them get kind of fuzzily blended into our regular budget process, recognizing at the same time that there will be things that we're able to fund in our budget out of American Rescue Plan dollars, but I think we can do that intentionally and with the vote of the council on amending our budget. Are there thoughts on that from administration or from my colleagues? Like I said, I saw some nodding. I see some, oh my God, it's already 11:20 on Wednesday faces too. So
Council President, I would say that the administration is very supportive of, the idea of saying, where we have priorities, let's go ahead and say we're going to spend this amount of money, and then put a work group together, map out, well, what does that mean? Let's get into the details for that. The one caution I would say is that if we think about it just in terms of ARP dollars, there may be other dollars that we have access to, like FEMA, HUD, things like that, that they have restrictions that ARP dollars don't. And so once we know what programming we want to advance, our finance team can really help us figure out which dollars are the smartest dollars to use on that. But in terms of like, how much money do we want to put toward priorities? I think ARP really gives us a good roadmap to say, let's be bold, let's go and make transformational change in some of these areas.
Yeah, and I appreciate and hope that that finance and our team will continue to remind us that some priorities that we may have that we think are ARP dollars actually will have another natural funding source through a different bucket coming out of the federal government. And I think I've said this before, but it's so unusual for us to receive federal dollars in this manner that I have to keep on, it's like pinching myself, like, oh, there's earmarks. Oh, so I do think, like we definitely need to make sure that we're using the more narrow ARP dollars for what they are intended for, and pulling out the projects that qualify elsewhere, which was I think, as was mentioned earlier, I think we came together quickly around earmark requests that align with Representative McCollum's priorities and the areas that she represents, and also lighten the load for our own budget. So I appreciate that. It's complicated, but it's a complicated in a good and important way. And I think a lot of the things, I know yesterday we asked Ms. Houston to share our council work plan again with the deputy mayor and with the finance team, so they're reminded of which priorities that we've identified as the policies that we're putting first on our list this year. And I think that they're very much in alignment with the things that we're talking about here today. Again, we got these guidelines 2 days ago, and there's a work in progress, but message sent, I believe, that we are here to partner on this from day one, and to the extent that we can find seats on these work groups as they are formed, and as well as the strategy, that is the expectation. And we're excited to work with you and appreciate the thoughtfulness. I really appreciated Ms. Logston talking about the intentionality of being on the webinars with the National League of Cities, with the, the League of Minnesota Cities, and being, really intentional about how we tie into the bigger network is heartening as well. So thank you for that. We'll have you back soon, early and often, to continue talking about this, and the groups that are folks that are serving on groups will report in on our monthly org committee meetings as well. So we'll get regular updates on that. All right, we need to shift gears to our closed door session. So I'm going to thank you all for your report here today. We really appreciate the information and getting in the loop early. Thanks much.
Thank you.
All right. So there's a lot ahead of us in terms of those dollars, and hopefully this is helpful. If folks have additional questions that come up, please send them through Holly or ask directly, and then also we can continue to invite the administration to our org committee meetings to make sure that we're checking in on a very regular basis. Again, this is an extraordinary time. Ms. Nager.
Thanks, Council President. I know we need to move straight to our closed door. Is there any chance we could take a 3 to 4 minute pause before that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Most definitely.
Anybody else who might want one?
I was just trying to get the other folks off the line.
Yep, totally.
No, we'll take a quick pause. I think my phone says it's 11:20 or 11:20. So actually, if we could start to, why don't we just say 11:30? Is that all right? And it's closed door session, or try to get there as close to in 5 minutes from now as possible. As soon as we have a quorum, we'll get going. So let's shoot for 11:25, 11:26. All right, see you in a second. We are adjourned.
Thanks.